Good evening. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for this medieval bodies panel discussion. The medieval era is a much maligned period in our history. It's often assumed that this is a time of superstition, ignorance, blind trial and error, of people living a degraded existence in squalid conditions, blighted by diseases that they couldn't understand. But this is not the full story. As we will hear tonight, medieval people had complex, sophisticated, and imaginative ways of thinking about and understanding their bodies. This evening's webinar is part of a programme of events relating to Cambridge University Library's current exhibition, Curious Cures: Medicine in the Medieval World, which is free to visit and open until the 6th of December. The exhibition was inspired by a Wellcome-funded project to make medieval medical recipes more accessible to historians of medicine, of whatever specialism or disciplinary approach. And it is our privilege to hear from three such experts this evening, who between them will dissect the medieval body, and share their knowledge of how medieval people thought about how their bodies functioned. And they are Hannah Bower, teaching associate in the Faculty of English and college lecturer at Churchill College, Cambridge. Hannah's research explores the relationships between literature, bodies, and emotions, and she's written about the linguistic and imaginative connections between medieval medical recipes and canonical literary writings. We're also joined by Philippa Carter, University Assistant Professor in History of Medicine and Health before 1800 and Fellow of Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge. Philippa's research interests are in medicine, natural knowledge, natural historical knowledge, belief and the body, in particular understandings of mental and physical illness, mind-body relationships, and sciences of the psyche. And last and by no means least, Jack Hartnell, Head of Research at the National Gallery in London. Jack is a specialist in the art of late medieval and early modern Europe and the Middle East. His research, teaching, and curating focus on the history of art and visual culture in the very broadest sense, investigating the relationship between art objects, their makers, audiences, and original contexts. We'll start with opening remarks from each of the panelists, followed by half an hour's discussion. The Q&A function is open for everyone to submit questions, and there'll be time at the end to bring these in. But if they relate to the discussion as it's happening, I might pose a question on an ad hoc basis. So, who would like to start? Jack, Hannah, Philippa, who would like to go first? Shall we go in alphabetical order by surname? Hannah, would you like to set the ball rolling?
Sorry, yep, sure, of course. So I'm going to start by talking just in my opening remarks about some of the preconceptions I had about the medieval body and how they've been challenged. And the main one I had was about the intricacy of medieval models of the body. They're actually really intricate, even if they are a little bit mistaken. There's a lot of sophistication and care there, and that's what I'd like to focus on today in my opening remarks. So let's think of an example. Some of you may have heard of the medieval system of the four humours. This theory, which we'll come back to a lot today, I'm sure, stated that every person was made up of a unique balance of four different humours. Now, these humours were fluid substances that were found in the body, and they had different characteristics. So we had black bile, which was cold and dry, yellow bile, which was hot and dry, phlegm, which was wet and cold, and blood, which was hot and wet. And every human being, in fact, everything on Earth in the Middle Ages, was thought to be made up of these. But everyone had their own unique ideal proportion, and that equivocated to say of health. So my healthy proportion would be different to yours. And that would affect my character. So if I had a little bit more black bile in my makeup, I might be a little bit more melancholy. And that healthy balance was shaped by gender, environment, and age. People were thought to dry out as they got older. And it was also in constant danger of being disrupted. So by the food you ate, by the pollution in the air, by the weather and the seasons, the emotions you experienced during the day, and where the planets were in the sky at that time. And when that balance was disrupted and one of the humours went out of whack and became more prominent, that's when you became sick. And you had to cure that by something that had the opposite humoral makeup. So if you're a bit too phlegmy, had too much phlegm, not in the way that we think of it now, but in the humoral sense, then you had to find a plant that was the opposite. So the opposite of phlegm would be hot and dry, because phlegm is cold and wet. And I think there's a real sort of beauty to this system of opposites and contrasts. And though it seems superficially simple, it actually gets complex quite quickly. Staying healthy is conceived as a sort of act of constant rebalancing and recalibrating in a world of sort of ever-changing environmental factors. And you have to do everything at exactly the right time in an ideal world. So if you're going to get a medical treatment or you're going to have an operation, ideally you would check that there are no negative influences coming from the planets at that time. And I think it's interesting that modern medicine is actually trying to get to grips with a similar thing. I recently read an article in the New Scientist magazine about medical research into the ways that circadian rhythms and our sort of personal body clocks actually affect our responsiveness to medical treatments when those medical treatments are delivered at different times of the day. And the article was reflecting on how that might be sort of factored into the delivery of medical services. So I think modern medical research is really interested in the benefits of tailored, individualized medicine and the challenges of delivering that en masse. And interestingly, learned medieval physicians were navigating similar challenges, I think. And my final point, it's just worth saying that medical practitioners of all kinds were not just navigating this humoral model of medicine, they were also both learned and amateur interested in magic and magical films of healing, which is another really complex body of knowledge that I think we're going to get stuck into later. So I'm going to leave that for now, but I'd just like to emphasize the intricacy of the medieval body for me. Thank you.
Brilliant, Hannah. That's a great introduction to the kind of one of the fundamental principles of medieval medical kind of theory and thinking. And you're quite right in, you know, that sort of that system of balances and proportions. It just is endlessly complicated because it just permeates their thinking about every aspect of life, every plant, every material has those qualities and properties and the potential to have an impact on the body, which it's just, yeah, the devil is in the detail with the humans, I think, isn't it? Great. Philippa, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James. I think one thing that I was reflecting on actually going to the exhibition this last weekend was the ways in which the introductory placards that you put up, James, really stress the things that bring us close to medieval people and their experiences, as well as the things that make us different. And it's easy, you know, listening to explanations of astrology and magic to think of these people as profoundly other and living in a very different thought world. And it's also easy alongside that, and has often been done, that, as you've said in the intro, James, it becomes a kind of flippant joke, medieval medicine, you know, talking about quacks and leeches and bloodletting and everything else. And I think in my own research, I've often found it difficult in that the intuitive response to that can be to say, no, they were rational, they were extremely rational, and what they did was very rational. But in some ways, that's not doing justice to the whole landscape of medieval medicine either, in the sense that I think when we think broadly about healing, health, and illness, and what it's like to experience illness and to try to remedy it, we realize that, in fact, the problem there is not in thinking about rational versus irrational for the medieval past, as it is about our approach and whether or not we're taking an approach of condescension where we assume that we are completely rational observers looking back on this past. And I think, for me, actually going through the experience of the first stages of the COVID pandemic and realizing there are plenty of moments where actually our medical knowledge was advancing and our behaviors were not necessarily moving in sync with that, so that we carried on doing things like desperately sanitizing our hands, even though we knew that we had evidence that it was a respiratory illness and that there was no reason really to be doing all the sanitizing of surfaces and hand washing. And I think that suggests to me that actually when we think about rationality and soothing and safety and these embodied experiences, actually we're looking back at a period where there is maybe a wider range of options when it comes to making sense of health and illness, but nonetheless not one that can be reduced down to were they right or were they wrong, and why did they do that crazy thing. So that was my reflection, that in many ways I think, and you put it really well, James, in the actual exhibition, that these are experiences that we all have in common as human beings, and that there are some perennial aspects to those experiences.
Thanks very much, Philippa, and thank you very much for referencing the exhibition. Much appreciated. Yeah, well, indeed, and I was thinking in the selection of the exhibits and the way in which they were presented, of the way in which the medieval period could hold, and the manuscripts could hold a mirror up to people and give us an opportunity to reflect in the ways that you've described on our own experiences of illness. And yes, I certainly remember with the COVID pandemic thinking, oh, I'm living through some history now. I'm really in the kind of on the very edge of time, and we just simply don't know and don't fully understand the diseases that the disease that's around us now. And I imagine a lot of people sort of harken back to experiences of bubonic plague and other epidemic illness, though drawing sort of questionable historical parallels, but some of the experience I think was shared. Jack, would you like to finish off the intros?
Sure, and I'll also bring us to the exhibition in a sense, because the thing that I always like to, the kind of anecdote that I always like to share whenever I talk about this kind of material with people is it's a bit of actually audience research that was done not by historians or academics, but by a museum, by the Victorian Albert Museum, when in 2014 they redid a suite of their display galleries, their medieval and Renaissance galleries that take you all the way from around the year 300 to the year 1600 through a kind of fascinating and wonderful display of objects in many different kinds of media with real intricacy, with very beautiful and interesting things. And they really wanted to try and get to the heart of what the average kind of, visitor to a museum understood by these two terms. They'd always been called, pretty much since the foundation of the Victorian Albert Museum in the mid-19th century, the medieval and Renaissance galleries. At least that's what they've become to be known as. What do people understand by these two terms? And I love it because this anecdote illustrates that the physical space of the museum, the gallery, the occasion of the exhibition is a great moment for engaging with and understanding people's preconceptions, what from a historical perspective we might sometimes label misconceptions, but also that objects are a great way to foreground those discussions. So they said, they did this different kinds of responses. They asked people for sort of a free-flowing response. What pops into your mind when you hear the word Renaissance? And they gathered together, they asked people for the top 5 words, a kind of bit of a question asked the top 5 words that pop into their mind, and then just ask them to sort of muse on the idea of the Renaissance. So the top 5 words, you can kind of play along at home, I wonder. The top 5 words for the Renaissance as a concept were, perhaps predictably, lightness, whiteness. I think you're kind of bright white marble, perhaps, because the third was Michelangelo, right? So, kind of fantastic, famous Italian artist, and in fact the fourth was Italy, and the fifth word was intelligence. I always think that this sort of feels a bit like an advert for quite a posh orange juice, perhaps, and some of the free, I write them down because they're great. Someone said, I'm in Florence, walking by the river at midday. It's peaceful. I'm smiling. I'm an artist's model, and he's sculpting the Madonna and Child. Someone else wrote, the sunshine sparkles. There's a little glade and a little lake. There's philosophy. People sitting around talking about politics, books, music. I want to stay and dream. What a wonderful time it is. It's really concretized in the kind of average, and this is just people walking in off the street in South Kensington in London, just saying, what do you think of the word Renaissance? It's quite a beautiful time. We can perhaps predictably think that maybe the situation was somewhat less favorable when it came to, what do you think of when you think of the word medieval? The 5 words, again, somewhat predictably: huts, dark ages, right? Mud, God. I don't think this is a nice God either. This is like a God that does a lot of smiting. And my all-time favorite, potatoes. Right. So, and if you know the history of the potato, which I'm sure everyone in this webinar does, and if you don't, really, you should do, the history of tubers, right? This is only a tuber, a kind of root that is brought and reliably grown in Europe, long, in the 16th century, some way after what we would think of the Middle Ages as having ended, the responses, I think, are also revealing. Someone says, I'm in a dungeon wearing a potato sack and it's night, it's cold, there are rats, the windows have bars at floor level, I stole some potatoes for your newborn child. Potatoes. I do think there's I think there's probably like a kind of Baldric style turnip, like a Blackadder reference maybe somewhere in the kind of British psyche there. But this, I think, is telling to what we're talking about today.
I recently watched Monty Python and the Holy Grail and realised that it got a lot to answer for when it comes to.
There you go. Maybe, yeah. I mean, so, and the other, I like this one. There are soldiers, peasants, high castles, muddy lowlands, black death and plague are all around. People are drunk on mead and fighting amongst themselves. The artists are not respected. So that sense of like disease, I think is very closely pinned, and actually a sense of health, the kind of things that we're talking about, the kind of things that you show so brilliantly in the exhibition are actually much more complex. And I love the word that Hannah used here, intricate and entangled than we might think, and that we are not, in fact, maybe perhaps so perfect in our own minds, exactly as Philippa also says, is really captured in that. And what I love is the way that actually the curators of the Victorian Albert Museum really pushed against this idea. So right from the beginning, from the very room with the very earliest objects, many of the walls are bright and white. The exhibition cases, some of which hold these massive pieces of stone, are raised ever so slightly off the ground as if to float. And so the way that they're conveying and presenting objects is already trying to do a lot of work to push against those preconceptions. And so for me, I guess the thing that I would draw our attention to, and we can't exactly do it in a webinar. It'd be great if we could, and so at some point in the future we'll be able to do these like digital handling sessions where we'll have manuscripts and various different kinds of institutions around the world trying to sort of start to think about how we can do that. But to remind ourselves that pretty much everything that specialists of literature, of history, of art history like myself, everything that we've engaged with has sort of come down to us often through an object, a physical object, in many cases of a manuscript. So an object that has its own quite complex material histories, and sometimes the best way to get into them, even if you don't really understand any of the detail, is you go to your local, I don't know, records office. If you live near Cambridge, go see the show. If you live near anywhere which has around the country, around the world, which has a public collection of medieval objects, often manuscripts, you can call them up and just sit and look at them. And even if you don't read Latin, I think you are likely to kind of get something, especially if you maybe have an illustrated manuscript in front of you, something of the kind of exquisite nature of many of these survivals, from the very kind of poorly illustrated and quickly written all the way through to some of the most luxurious objects that survive. So yeah, don't forget the object.
Thanks very much, Jack. I think you're absolutely right that that ability to connect with the medieval period through objects and through manuscripts in particular, which we use in the same way that in the same, literally the same physical movements and actions that a medieval person would have done. You're holding the book, you're putting it on a table, you're turning the pages, you're reading the words. That for me has always... You're
smelling the thing. And one of the things that, you will know this because James, for the audience, James deals with these kind of objects every day in his kind of work, as do many kind of librarians and archivists around the world. But one of the most striking things when you actually get to kind of turn the pages, they don't smell bad. They smell, it's a kind of, how you get a new book smell, right? There is a manuscript smell. And there's a really great historian of kind of medieval art who was writing, mainly around the year 2000 and just before, Michael Camille, who was really kind of wanted in a lot of his work was encouraging historians, but just people generally, when they look at these images, especially on a digital screen, or especially blown up, projected, much bigger than they actually are, to think about the physical object, but the way it sounds, the creak of the kind of crinkle of the page, the way it smells. These are physical objects to be embodied and engaged with in different ways.
Thanks very much, Jack. I can see that questions are coming in from the chat, so there's lots of ideas and responses that are being kind of provoked already by what's been said so far. I have a few questions of my own, if I may put those to you first, panelists. So shall we start with let's start with a question that often gets posed by people who visit the exhibition. Philippa, I wonder if you could respond to this. People who've come to the exhibition often ask about mental health in the Middle Ages. Was there such a concept? And if not, how did people at the time describe or conceptualize phenomena that we now frame in that way? And how did they think about their minds and their mentalities, as it were?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know someone in the chat has made the point that the Middle Ages span nearly 1,000 years. That's a very good point, and it's one we do need to bear in mind. And it's also worth bearing in mind that we're not talking about a homogeneous block of people. We're talking about many different individuals from many different walks of life, even if we're just thinking about the kind of zones that are covered by the exhibition, which I think is primarily Arabo-Islamic and Christian, Latin Christian worlds. But within that, I would say that there are some commonalities when it comes to thinking about mental health and illness. Interestingly, I think that it would be fair to say that they do talk about diseases of mind, but not necessarily about mental health. And the fact that these days we usually do talk about mental health is something that I think is interesting to think about, that we've normalized it in one sense, and I think that's a good thing. That said, they do talk about health of mind and body. What makes it a slightly complicated question to answer is that for theologians, learned physicians, anyone who is kind of learned in the university tradition, the mind is simultaneously a part of the soul and in life also embodied. And this creates a sort of tension which is central to a lot of Abrahamic religions, I think, where on the one hand, you would like the soul and the body to be separable. Perhaps you even think about them in slightly oppositional terms, and therefore the health of the soul and the health of the body should be thought of as distinct. You know, one of them is immaterial, going to survive forever. One of them is definitely material and is going to corrupt and rot. And for all that I don't want to reiterate the trope of mud, I do think that we see in a lot of these texts a concern with corruption of various sorts, and it's often related to a very ambivalent relationship with decay. So I'm thinking about the wonderful tomb that you've got in the exhibition with all the worms coming out of the eyes and so on. They think a lot about decay and how to stave it off. So I think that this sort of thinking about mind-body relations in very different terms does lead to a kind of quite firm division of labor when it comes to the health of the soul and the health of the body, where the health of the soul is supposed to be the remit of the confessor, the priest, or whoever your local representative of the Roman Church is, and the physician is supposed to keep their remit to the health of the body. But in practice, in life, we do have embodied minds, and actually, particularly from the 13th century onwards, with the growth of Galenic Hippocratic understandings of disease, comes an understanding that actually, if something goes wrong in the head, particularly the organ of the brain, then that will affect the mind. How exactly that squares with spiritual afflictions is something that they wrestle with a lot. But there is this very strong notion that actually there can be a purely naturalistic explanation for what we would understand as mental illnesses. And these are very much exist in tension. And it's not like people aren't willing to go to the naturalistic explanation, it's just they have many more possible causal explanations than we do. So they are willing to consider this might be a purely natural disease if someone is showing quite severe mental health problems. They're also willing to consider it might be a spiritual affliction sent by God. And they're also willing to consider that it might be diabolic vexation or possession. And often they do start off with all these options on the table, and which conclusion they reach depends a lot on who is the person doing the diagnosing. So I'd say mental illness, mental health, not precisely as we understand it, because the mind is a part of the soul. But that's not to say that they were incapable of medicalizing mental health problems. Many physicians were increasingly leaning towards those kinds of naturalistic explanations.
That's great. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, kind of opens up the issue that there are all these different possible explanations which we for medical and disease phenomena that we wouldn't now think of as kind of as possibilities, and that was how the medieval mind was kind of seeking answers and explanations. And it's also interesting actually that the emphasis on the person to whom one was directing one's appeal, as it were, as a patient, that would determine the kind of response. And I mean, I suppose we see a similar analogy in the, modern era. You will go to your pharmacist who will, prescribe you something. You will go to your GP who will suggest something. You go get a different answer from your counselor or therapist, and so that's fascinating. Thank you. Hannah, Jack, do either of you have anything to chip in, or shall I?
Well, I just say, I mean, again, Hannah will know more in terms of how this is brought to life in the literature of the period, but I guess the link between mental health and states of extreme kind of often madness in terms of is a kind of complex one, but that is something that we find, especially in broader culture, quite a lot of concern around. That one might go mad, especially in particular in political writing, that the head of state, right, taking that bodily metaphor, which it really is prominent in European 12th century and slightly earlier as well, but especially for the 12th century, this bodily metaphor for the state is really affirmed in many different kinds of political writing. And the head of state, right, contains the brain. If the head of state goes mad, as is kind of famously documented in various examples of kind of loony kings, as they're described often by the people who succeed them, maybe convenient political caricatures, but nonetheless, there's a sense that is a real sense of concern, and that a loss of one's faculties is something to be potentially feared, in part because maybe, as Philip is saying, although you have many different options for cure, that maybe they, I think we do also have to generally step back and say that there is also a quite a comfortable acceptance for the whole of the pre-modern era, but especially in the periods that we're often talking about when we refer to the broad period of the Middle Ages, that medicine's just not as effective as we think of it today, right? You take a pill, your headache goes away, or it doesn't. There's quite a binary, it works, it doesn't work. But often there's a sense that there's a hope that it will work, but depending on the kind of medicine, spiritual medicine, for instance, you've got to work the spiritual medicine, you've got to better yourself, confess, or whatever, depending on your kind of particular brand of religion you might subscribe to. So I think there's a sense of, especially that comes through a lot in again, non-medical texts, a sense that madness or that a loss of one's mental capacity is something to really worry about.
Absolutely, no, it's huge. I mean, the natural philosophical definition of man, in the broad sense, is a rational animal, and so it's hugely worrying for them that the faculty of reason might be taken away, precisely because they see it as part of the image of God in man, the sort of stamp of uniquely human power. And yes, they worry an awful lot about madness. I mean, Hannah will know that there are various amazing accounts. In fact, I should probably hand over to
Oh no. Well, yeah, I was just thinking as you were saying there, Philip, actually, of a 15th century poet and government clerk, Thomas Hoccleve, who writes an amazing poem about having had what we would call a mental breakdown, and he describes himself being cast out of himself in a really sort of visceral way, and sort of amasses all these different explanatory frameworks from it. Did it come from God? Was it something else? And you're left guessing with Hoccleve, and he also thinks that it's past now, but he says everybody else is still looking at him as if he's still mad. And there's a wonderful scene where he leaps in front of a mirror and tries to catch himself unawares, so that he can see if he looks mad. So yeah, anyone who thinks that the Middle Ages isn't about the individual and sort of self-reflection, I think that's a wonderful place to start to challenge that.
Although leaping in front of a mirror is quite a mad thing to do.
True.
So he's not helping. He's not helping himself.
No.
Yeah.
This is a perfect segue actually for a question that I had for you, Hannah, which is, we often talk about running out of steam, not having enough bandwidth, feeling recharged, or running on fumes. All these figures of speech that we draw from the machine age or the digital age. So what figures of speech did Hoccleve or other medieval writers that you've studied and researched use when they're writing and talking about their bodies and how they function or don't function?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. I suppose in the medical side, immediately I think there's a long history of an idea in Greek and Arabic thought that you have kind of innate heat and innate radical moisture, and these are the two kind of essential forces of life, and they're often figuratively represented as sort of fuel to a flame, or oil to a lamp, that you're sort of burning through this. And some sort of theorists thought that you had a sort of pre-allotted amount when you were born of moisture, that you would then sort of work through as you reach death, when you really did dry out completely. And I guess that's a kind of idea of burnout, that we use it in a very different way now, in a kind of intense period of activity, but they also used it in that sort of sense of a life course, that you were burning out over your life, which I find really interesting. And I also think on a small scale, actually, I'm fascinated by the way in sort of really accessible, practical texts, you know, herbals, recipes, that people who were educated, but also people who were literate, but maybe hadn't got a really long education behind them, but they could read, were using. Often in these texts, there are sort of similes and metaphors that help you identify things really nicely. And I always think the uroscopy text, which I know there's a wonderful chart in the exhibition, that shows all the different colours your urine could be and how to diagnose the illness you might have from that. And these were sort of accompanied by a standard set of similes in texts that helped you identify that colour. And sometimes people add little bits to them. So your urine might be like milk, or it might be like milk when it's cold. So they could get increasingly detailed and careful. And I think there's a really beautiful image in those texts, actually, talking about the sediment. I mean, bear with me, it does get beautiful. The sediment in the urine and the kind of particles within it. And they're compared to motes or specks of dust in the sunshine. And I always just think that's really quite beautiful. And other writers at the time used similar images in very different contexts. So the medieval mystic, Marjorie Kemp, describes in one of her divine visions lots of white things flying around her like motes of dust in the sun. I think it's amazing these sort of homely similes could do the lowly urine and then the sort of lofty divine at the same time.
And it also shows the sheer observational acumen of people, that they, like, I don't think I would be able to tell from a distance the difference between hot milk and cold milk, you know, but the fact that they had this sort of connoisseurship for the natural world, in many ways, I think even if you handed a GP today a flask of your urine, they wouldn't be able to do much with it by sight, but these physicians clearly did, you know, although I always get really worried thinking about the patients who are producing some of these colours.
Yeah.
I was going to say that one of my favourites is to do with reproduction, where they talk all the time about seed, which makes a lot of sense because that's where we get the word semen from. But also in women, they talk about the menstrual cycle as the flowers, because they talk about the child that gestates as the fruit. So they think of the menses not just as kind of shedding, but as what happens, the blossom before the fruit. And I think that's really lovely. They have this real kind of agricultural metaphor that expands across the generative capacity of male and female.
Anyone who has grown fruit or vegetables for themselves will think of those as their children. Although I now realise that I'm admitting to a form of cannibalism, but yes, I can. That is a lovely kind of way of thinking about the sort of childbirth and fertility. An agricultural metaphor. Thanks very much, Hannah, as well. I don't think I'll ever look at those urine flasks in quite the same way. Jack, we take it for granted that modern medical textbooks are heavily illustrated, but generally speaking, medieval manuscripts are not. They're devoid of images or diagrams of the body. Why is this?
I think you can think about this in a few different ways. I mean, firstly, it's important to really think about how complex and potentially expensive it is to produce a manuscript, in fact, to produce the parchment from which medieval books were often made towards the end of the period. And we're talking again, to be specific, about say Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Paper starts to circulate slightly more, but really, if we're thinking about a book that's being produced in the period before then, the pages are often produced of parchment, that is a kind of essentially animal skin, normally skin of sheep. Sometimes lots of different animals actually are used, but often sheep, lambs, sometimes cows as well. Are kind of undergoes quite a complex process of having first the hairs kind of sloughed off in various alkaline baths, then having it being scraped down, stretched, dried, and that's just like one animal to produce one quite large page, which is then folded. Forget about the fact that it needs to be stitched into multiple quires, quires, quires of folios that together then need to be bound inside often quite beautiful bindings themselves covered in leather, sometimes tooled and decorated. And this is just to get to the material on which you then produce materials. So kind of text. Well, also you need to know how to write, which is not something that necessarily large swathes of the population in this period had great facility with. So already there's like a lot stacked against the medieval image. It takes a lot to have the combined resources, skill, kind of complex material know-how, and then also the knowledge to contain and kind of to have contained within such an object. So when you start to think about writing in that sense and the kind of written word, you realize that these are probably quite special occasions. Firstly, someone asked, I think, in the chat about kind of how material and ideas in terms of medicine are passed on. So we have to be really clear that it's not only in books. So the reason the medical textbook is partly illustrated today is because it's very easy to do so. And it's very easy to print and produce many of those things at scale to standardize medicine. I don't know how much of an interest there actually is in the same way in this period in standardizing medicine. So the very venture maybe is a slightly different one, has a slightly different texture. So in a sense, producing images is part of, there's lots of practical and reasons why it's expensive. But I would say also, why are you doing it is one of the big questions. So actually the example that Hannah mentioned of this urine wheel is a really interesting one. But we call it urine wheel because when it is produced in kind of visual form, sometimes you have like quite a beautiful image of a tree sprouting, and you have lots of different little urine flasks that are drawn, and the individual color is illustrated. But more often than not, uroscopic texts survive with descriptions of the color rather than a flask, sometimes just an empty flask, or sometimes a flask which is just drawn in like black ink as if it's full, and the color comes through the description: green like cabbage, black like dark horn, which is not great. Again, not what you want in your urine. But the point here is that, so in a way, actually, a lot of descriptive language is deployed, meaning that images aren't always necessary. So all of these things mean there's less likelihood for an image to be produced. But actually, also the other thing I would say is that when images are produced, and they're not uncommon, they're not as common as manuscripts are entirely made up of text, but when they are produced, they're often doing slightly different work for the user of the book. So you might think, for instance, again, of a uroscopic wheel, and so imagine that you're coming to me for a diagnosis, and instead of just telling you what is actually quite an easily memorable amount of information, think how much information that a modern medic today takes in from a textbook, right? Think of all those med students you see like in a cafe hunched over with textbooks, right? No reason why someone in the medieval past is not consuming as much, if not more, information when they're understanding the world, right? So these are smart people, often people inclined towards very active and keen memories. They know everything that's in quite a small diagram, right? So why have the diagram? Partly because it might be a teaching document. It's about memory. It's a mnemonic. It encourages people to recollect, and you get lots of different medical diagrams that seem to be doing just that picture different regions of the body in relation to different celestial patterns, for instance, that have quite is a nice way of helping you remember this material. So it's didactic. But it might also be, maybe we should think about these manuscripts as being a bit like part white coat, part like medical diploma on the wall, part really fancy doctor's waiting room, right? What would reassure you if you're coming to me? Let's take a different example, because someone also asked about physicians, and someone asked about orthopedics. Think about medieval surgeons. A great example, especially I'm talking in later medieval Europe. These are individuals who are trained in kind of guilds through workshop practice. Essentially, they're hands-on crafts, right? Think of the etymology of the word surgery. From the Greek chirurgos, handiwork. It's hands-on stuff, right? So we have many surgeons in the period who do not, in fact, resort to writing things down or to making diagrams. So why would a surgeon have such a thing? Say that you, I don't know, needed a particular kind of surgery on the surface of your body. You see, you have a scar, you wanted it stitched. You come to me, I reach up to my extremely expensive medical book, flip it open, maybe consult a really beautiful diagram, sometimes with gilding and complex colors. Clearly not something that, like, if you were it's like a trauma patient on the battlefield who I was running to, I'm not bringing that manuscript with me, right? So instead, you come to me, I open this up. There's something of the performance there. You go, aha, Jack's well paid. And if he's well paid, it means a lot of his patients have survived these procedures to pay him. So that's one thing. And then secondly, wow, Jack's quite smart. He can read this text. Wow, he can look at this quite complex, detailed diagram. There's a performative aspect. So maybe we should think about these images, less as kind of just doing illustrative work, and maybe more as tools, really, just like we would think of a surgeon's knife or surgical saw. And in that sense, they're doing different kinds of work. So maybe they don't survive because not all surgeons, for instance, need that work to be done.
This scenario that you're imagining of the surgeon's consultation room, Jack, brings us to a question that someone in the audience has asked about. Today we've got the NHS, but how in the medieval period was healthcare delivered? Who did it? Where did it happen? Is there anything surprising in what we know from the written sources that survive? Philippa, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, a very variegated landscape, no National Health Service, nothing even close for a very long time, really. And there were, in some larger cities and towns, kind of civic authorities would take upon themselves to offer healthcare to the whole city or town. So that's the closest thing you'd get to something like that, a kind of urban oligarchical structure where they appoint specific physicians and surgeons, and often will actually provide healthcare to the poor as well as the rich, but only if you belong, if you're considered to have right to reside within that city or that parish. On the ground, things tend to be a lot more of a postcode lottery, I guess we could say, so maybe more like the NHS than we'd like to admit, in the sense that if you're in London, for example, or if you're in Paris, then you may well have access to a learned physician. They're relatively small in number in comparison to other kinds of medical practitioners, but there are major centres like Montpellier, Cambridge and Oxford, Britain in general, not the cutting edge of medical education at this time, but many English physicians did go to the continent and came back with medical doctorates. Could take up to a decade or 7 years, and obviously took a lot of money and time. And even after that, you were expected to do some shadowing and so on. So high fees, very well qualified, probably have those beautiful books on their shelves, but not accessible for everybody. And so a huge amount of medical provision was covered by other sorts of practitioners. So there were surgeons and apothecaries, which, as Jack mentioned, are trained via guilds or corporations. Depending on where you are, there might be different conglomerates. So sometimes you get barber surgeons where they do the barbering and the surgery. Sometimes apothecaries and grocers band together, and sometimes you get different medleys. So in Scotland, for example, physicians and surgeons team up quite early on. And they are, again, expensive but more affordable. They're viewed as kind of manual crafts. So I think you say in the exhibition, James, that technically speaking, they're only supposed to be addressing afflictions on the outside of the body, and they're supposed to be leaving internal physic and internal complaints to the physicians. But in practice, that's a very difficult boundary to police, because if you're thinking about something like hemorrhoids or fistula and ano, as one English specialist was well known for his ability to do surgery on anal fistula, which is pretty dicey. Then you start to collapse that boundary already. And indeed, there is a sense that on the ground, these divisions between different kinds of practitioners were not always well sustained. So many people got a license in surgery, but then claimed to be a physician, and vice versa. And then beyond the world of kind of medical licensing, the vast majority of healthcare was done in the home by housewives and by local healers. Hannah mentioned magic. There are many kinds of cunning folk and other sorts of healers who offer a kind of blend of herbal and magical approaches, often with elements of liturgy as well. And then important to say that the orders of the church, the monks and friars and nuns and canons, often were major medical providers in this period, because they're quite diffuse geographically, because they often don't take payment, or they don't take extremely high fees, and because they have access to medical learning. They often have big monasteries, priories with libraries, so that they have this kind of medical learning, which they then, particularly the friars, and Peter Jones has just produced a wonderful book on the friars in England, have a kind of itineracy, so they can travel through different parishes, and that allows them to serve lower status people in their own towns and villages. So it's a very mixed landscape, and some places are much more highly developed in terms of kind of hierarchical structures of accreditation and training and so on. But usually someone had, because the marketplace was so diverse, it wasn't impossible to get help from someone. So it was there were actually many more medical practitioners than we might think, just not perhaps the ones that we might recognize today as learned physicians. You know, they don't end up in the Royal College of Physicians archives, but nonetheless, they probably did good work for their patients.
Thanks very much, Philippa. That's great. You mentioned you glanced on the household role of women and magic as well. I wonder if this is a good opportunity to bring Hannah in, because your research has been on the sort of interplay between medical recipes on the one hand and these instructions for magic tricks, illusions, but there are also medical charms and curing rituals. Would you like to just share with the audience, you know, some thoughts on the kind of context in which those sorts of performances took place, and kind of what that says about how people thought about these different texts?
Yeah, I'd love to. And as Philippa said, the sort of boundary obviously between magic and medicine is so blurred that you can get a herbal cure sort of mixed up or entangled or copied next to a spoken charm or a written charm, where you might write some random letters on parchment or divine names and bind it to your body. And it's not always clear whether medieval people felt themselves sort of transgressing into a different kind of treatment, or whether they felt that they were just different options or entangled options. It's very difficult to tell that, even though a lot of theologians were a little bit iffy about charms because they felt that you were sort of trying to constrain divine power there. But as you mentioned, James, I'm also really interested in sort of household books that were in sort of mercantile or gentry families, where you get large collections of medical recipes for things like colds and nosebleeds and everything, but mixed in amongst these, you get recipes for creating really cool tricks and illusions, like making someone look like they've got two heads, making someone look like they're on fire, making it look like the house is full of birds or snakes. And one of them that someone always says to me is like a medieval insurance claim is for making your house look like it's been flooded. I'm not quite sure worked out what the purpose of that is. But I think what's really interesting about a lot of these tricks is that sometimes they're imitating court spectacles. So there's lots of records of royal courts, you know, doing these great pageants where ships come into the court or the hall. So maybe they're a kind of sort of bargain bucket version of that. But they also present the body, I think, as a kind of interestingly sort of mangled or doubled or deformed, you know, two heads or on fire. And there's a kind of carnivalesque, I think, opposition between these and the recipes that they're mixed up with in these manuscripts that are trying to order and heal that body. So I think medieval people were really interested in play and entertainment, and, you know, they had manuscripts. Their manuscripts were expensive, so they needed it to do a lot of things. And you could mix these all up in one.
I suppose, Hannah, as well, an interesting kind of bridge between those two is thinking about cosmetics, which really was very much on a sliding scale with medical remedies, right? But some of them also play up to this illusionary thing of, you know, get rid of wrinkles with this one good trick, you know, or you know, to make a face white and smooth. And they often overpromise, right? Or they seem to overpromise. And I think this kind of sort of ranging from the strictly medical to the cosmetic to the speculative is super interesting.
Yeah, and actually I've come across a recipe to make yourself look like you've got leprosy, part of which was written in code. So that idea of sort of making yourself into looking like you're sick for whatever reason, that might be your financial gain, I think is really interesting too. And I should say that many of the other recipes work through sort of optical illusions. I didn't explain that, but sort of lamps with various rushes around that are supposed to look like snakes. I'm not sure how convincing that would be, but maybe we should try it sometime.
That's really interesting. I'd come across recipes about how to remove freckles, and I thought, oh, that's cosmetic. But then somebody said to me, oh, no, that's because there was a concern that spots on one's face might be misinterpreted as signs of disease. But in that example you cite, Hannah, evidently people are trying to make themselves look ill. Potentially, they can go out begging for alms or something like that. Although you would think that's a bit risky, because if word gets around that you're leprous, nobody's going to want to have anything to do with you, and you've made yourself a pariah, haven't you, in the kind of medieval world? So it's a double-edged sword. Yeah.
I mean, there is a romance narrative where a princess disguises herself and makes herself look ill, Bevis of Hampton. But that is to avoid being sort of assaulted by her husband's enemies in a world filled with giants and knights. So maybe not quite so relatable, but it's interesting. There's a literary parallel there too.
There's also a moment, right, in Bevis of Hampton where she kind of reveals her true self and she's glowing and white. And so, yeah, James, I don't think that freckles are necessarily always about disease. I think they're in the trota, which you mentioned in the exhibition. There is a lot that is clearly about beauty standards as much as it is about health. But I think that's the point, and Joseph Ziegler has written about this, that they very much see that on a continuum as well, so that beauty and health go hand in hand, which is also something that I think resonates today.
We've had a question about how medieval people thought about medical knowledge before their own time. Did people practicing medicine disregard the knowledge that had been gained during Roman times because it was considered, pagan and kind of old-fashioned? Does anybody like to jump in?
Well, I think often it's at least in the learned and literary tradition, it's the reverse actually, and what you will see sometimes in the kind of visual qualities of the illustrations that accompany these texts as well is a real valorization of the knowledge of the the ancients, right? So the figure of Hippocrates, right, which modern historical approaches often are showing. We refer to the Hippocratic corpus, a collection of texts that probably were produced by a number of different people in and around the sphere of an individual called Hippocrates who's writing in ancient Greece. There's a real sense in which that sort of assigning of texts, or more, actually even on a more modular level, assigning of particular ideas to some of these ancient authors is really important. And indeed, it's not just ancient Greek authors. If we're talking about kind of Roman writers, Galen, right? Claudius Galen, Roman writer, is one of the most sort of cited in that sense. But it's also, and sort of writing or kind of referring to authorities is really complex. So sometimes it's, writers, for instance, the Arabic writer Ibn Sina, who's known in Latin as Avicenna, or kind of Latinized and Anglicized Avicenna. So it's not just the Roman classical past, it's also the Arabic classical past as well. But again, it depends where you're looking. So if you think about what actually are authors who are writing in a more surgical tradition, the authorities that they cite often aren't necessarily the great kind of theoretical greats. They're talking about like wealthy and high status patrons they have spoken of. I healed the king. I healed King, King Henry the whatever. I healed, the local lord of Northampton. So in a sense, you're almost citation, whether that's social citation or like scholarly citation, is quite a big thing that runs throughout a lot of this material. And sort of, I guess it gives a good. I think we can quite naturally associate with that. I always think of there's well man, well woman tablets that you see on the tube or on the back of a bus somewhere, and it's some celebrity going, "This really worked for me." It's like a sense of a sort of seal of approval running all the way through to a medical textbook in which it's citing the British Medical Journal or like different kinds of peer-reviewed scientific processes or different kinds of gathering of data. Right, even that sense, like what how does authority produced, I guess, is a big question, and it's one that people writing in the medieval past were just as concerned with as we are now.
There are some sort of celebrity endorsements, if you could call them that, that are cited often in Middle English medical recipes for a formulation called Gratia Dei, and they often go together in threes. And there's one that was used at an infirmary in Kneesworth or Kenilworth, and the transmission varies. There's one that's attributed to the Earl of Hereford, who was held to be a noble surgeon, and another one is the Countess of Warwick. So if they used it, yeah, like you say, it must be good.
It must work.
Sorry.
It must work.
It must work, exactly. What more kind of proof would you need?
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock, and I'm sorry to say we're almost out of time. So that at the end, we were going to each of us recommend some reading that we thought that the audience might be interested in. Before we do, I want to thank each of our panelists for participating in this evening. I feel it would be remiss of me not to recommend the panelists' books, which are all excellent. So Jack, his book, Medieval Bodies, published by Profile Books 2019, and he has forthcoming Wound Man, The Many Lives of a Surgical Image with Princeton University Press. Hannah Bauer's Middle English Medical Recipes and Literary Play with OUP, published in 2022. And many congratulations, Philippa. Philippa has just submitted her book, Frenzy in Early Modern England, Madness, Brain Disease, and the Soul, which is forthcoming with CUP, and we look forward to that very much. Panel members, do you have something that you would recommend to our audience before we close?
Yeah, I do. And it's a book that's actually been reissued several times. It's by a historian called Judith Bennett, and it's called A Medieval Life. I think the subtitle is something like Cecilia Pennyfader and the World of English Peasants Before the Plague, or something like that. I think that's exactly, in fact, what it is. And it's a book I always used to give to my students. It's very clearly written, not got heavy footnotes or anything, but it basically takes chapter by chapter different aspects of the life of one woman, an English peasant by the name of Cecilia Pennyfader, and thinks about aspects of her life, from her home to the church where she worshipped to, and draws on kind of very local historical documents. But I find I used to kind of reread it towards the end of the summer quickly, because it just gets, whenever I was turning to sort of teaching, I would always get back into that medieval mode, that medieval moment. And it just really was a great way of showing how like very simple, sometimes quite dry sources can actually take you directly to the sense of a medieval life. It's really compelling, I think.
Thanks very much. Hannah?
Yes, sorry. Mine has a similar local emphasis, actually. A Great Plague: A People's History by Evelyn Lord, which is exploring the plague in Cambridge, actually in 1665 and 1666, a little bit late in the medieval period, but it looks back to that period, and sort of reconstructs local lives and how the plague affected people of all different social stations in Cambridge, and sort of you'll recognise the names and locations if you live around here. So it's a good one for that.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Philippa? Oh, you're on mute, sorry. We can't get through a webinar without somebody having been on mute.
Rookie error, I'm so sorry.
No.
I would maybe actually recommend Peter Jones's book, and that's The Medicine of the Friars in Medieval England. Have I got that title right? The Medicine of the Friars in Medieval England, which came out with Boydell last year, I think.
Yes, recently, 2023, I think. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, it's very, very readable, and really, I think someone has asked him the questions about the contributions of the religious orders. It really kind of fills in a missing piece of that puzzle.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. Panelists in particular, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening, and for a very lively and engaging discussion. Thank you very much, and a very good evening.